That may be the greatest catch I've ever seen in my life.
Alright guys, I got this video as of late because all my friends who play in just casual fantasy football leagues, I mean, they know that I win my year-round beer money just basically playing in fantasy football leagues, a bunch of high-stakes dynasty fantasy football leagues. They've been asking me to draft their fantasy football teams. I've been noticing what casual drafters do very often that is extremely bad. For one reason or another, I got my top 3 mistakes that casual fantasy football drafters make that really limit their upside to winning their fantasy football league, and I'm going to overlay them, and I'm going to try to explain why you should avoid making these same mistakes. But before we get into the video, please guys, go down to the description of the video, and if you want to join a free fantasy football group chat, I mean, there's a link down there. We've had a lot of great discussion. Y'all can go down there. You can ask your start-sit questions. You can ask your trade questions and just talk about the NFL. I mean, we're all excited. We're all down there chatting pretty much nonstop every day. So please go down there, completely free. Just join the group chat. Love talking with y'all. Now, let's get into our first mistake that I see in pretty much every single casual fantasy football draft, and this is handcuffing. And yes, I understand that when you're drafting a fantasy football team, if you don't really understand the math behind it, if you don't understand what really wins fantasy football leagues, you have some very basic understandings that you come to just off of thinking on what you want to do. I mean, you draft Ezekiel Elliott in your first round, and you go, oh, okay, I mean, I'm loving my team through 8 rounds, but what if Ezekiel Elliott gets hurt? I mean, should I go out there and draft Tony Pollard and kind of lock in that production? Or same thing, you go out there and you draft Nick Chubb in your second round, and you go, oh man, I have the best team in the league through 4 rounds, but what if Nick Chubb gets hurt? I should probably go out there and draft Kareem Hunt in the 5th round. Or, oh guys, I took Dalvin Cook with my first round pick. I need to go out there and get Alexander Mattison to make sure I have that floor. And while in reality, all of this makes a ton of sense for someone who just gets into fantasy football or doesn't necessarily do a ton of research into what wins leagues. I mean, you would think that this is the optimal game strategy, but in reality, what this does is it raises your floor. Yes, if Ezekiel Elliott gets hurt, you're not going to just be completely the worst team in the league. I mean, you're going to have Tony Pollard who you can slide in, and he's going to be able to replace Zeke. But what this does is it limits your ceiling. I mean, you pretty much say, I'm not going to lose the league. I'm not going to get last place. But you know what you're also not going to do? You're not going to win the league. Most of y'all play in either a 10-man leagues or 12-man leagues. And if you're playing in a 10-man league, you have a 10% chance of winning your fantasy football championship. If you play in a 12-man league, you have about a 7 to 8% chance of winning that championship. So when you are taking a handcuff, what you are doing is you are saying this one bench spot that I could go through and I could use with the waiver wire. I could pick up the hot guy of the week. Maybe I can get some upside there. I'm going to lock that down. I'm going to lock that to one of my starting positions. Say you draft in Ezekiel Elliott and then you draft Tony Pollard in the 9th round. You say, I'm never going to cut that player. He's going to take that bench spot, and I'm never going to be able to use that bench spot for anything else. So that is the first bad thing about handcuffing. You pretty much throw away an extra roster spot where you are saying, I'm going to only play with 6 bench spots while everyone else in my league has 7. And at the same time, what you're doing is you have to understand when you are taking those guys on your bench, when you are taking those guys at the very end of your fantasy draft, you are kind of shooting for ceiling. You want the upside. You want the guys that are going to either completely ball out like we saw James Conner do a couple of years ago when Le'Veon Bell held out. You want to get guys that have an insane upside that you can one day see yourself plugging them in your starting lineup week over week. So when you take a guy like that, yes, he may have the upside, but if that bet hits where Tony Pollard gets his upside and he's actually a high-end RB2, when you are getting that production, you are also losing your best player on your fantasy football roster. So you are going out there and saying, yes, I am not going to ever win my fantasy football championship, because what you need to win your fantasy football championship is you need 2 RB1s. You don't need at least 1 RB1 and then possibly an RB3. I mean, that's not going to win you your league. You have to go out there, and what I really like doing is I love these handcuff running backs, but I'm not going to attach them with my running backs that I took in the 1st or 2nd round. So if I took an Ezekiel Elliott, instead of getting his backup, what I'm going to go do is I'm going to go get Kenyon Drake's backup in Chase Edmonds. Now, what happens if Kenyon Drake gets hurt this season and I have Ezekiel Elliott and Chase Edmonds? I then have 2 running back ones, and that is how you win your fantasy football league. You don't win your fantasy football league by raising your floor with handcuffs and limiting your upside. I can see doing that if you have a punishment to the last place. I mean, if you have to get a tattoo, if you get last place in your fantasy football league, I mean, by all means, I'm handcuffing every running back that I have. I don't care about winning. I'm just trying not to get last. But if you are just playing for a pot, if everyone put in $50 and you're trying to get that pot, I mean, I'm going to go out there and I'm going to get other teams' handcuffs, and I'm just going to bank on the players that I take in the first and second round staying healthy all year, because if they don't, I'm probably going to lose regardless. Now, another mistake that a lot of people make while they're drafting in casual fantasy football leagues is they are looking at their starting lineup as they draft. They're going, okay, I got my 2 running backs, I got my 3 wide receivers, now I need a quarterback or a tight end. In reality, that's not how you should be drafting. You should be drafting with the thought of value and how you are going to play out your entire fantasy football season. So when you go out there and through your first 6 rounds, you don't have a quarterback, there's no reason to feel the need to go out there and reach for a quarterback like a guy like Baker Mayfield in the 7th or a guy like Jimmy Garoppolo in the 7th, when you can wait till the very end of your draft and get a guy like Drew Lock, who is going to be able to provide you very similar production to the guy that you would take at your QB1 early in the draft, when you can get that at the very end of the draft, or you could potentially even stream the position if you're playing in a casual fantasy football league. I mean, I know there are a couple podcasts that actually go out there and they recommend streamers, and they keep track of their streamers throughout the entire season. And then pretty much you can piece together a top 6 quarterback position off the waiver wire every single week. So this is what we are going to try to do. We're not necessarily going to go out there and feel the need to reach on a quarterback when you can get a guy at the very end of your draft. What you want to do is you want to continue to load up on running backs and wide receivers. I mean, this is why it's funny. Year over year, I draft a team for my friends, and they go, Mason, what the hell? I mean, Yahoo says I'm going to go 4-9. What team did you draft me? And every single year, they realize past week 3, oh my God, I have one of the best teams in the league. It's because you load up on the running backs and wide receivers, and then you filter through the quarterbacks and tight ends. Your starting lineup does not have to be completely set during your fantasy football draft. You are going to have the waiver wire. You are going to be able to make moves. What you want is you want a ton of stud wide receivers and running backs, the tight end position and the quarterback position. Don't feel the need to reach on them. If you do get a value, say you get a George Kittle falling to you in the 3rd round, by all means, take it. I mean, for example, if you want to look at what high-stakes fantasy football drafters are doing, guys that are putting up $5,000 for a fantasy league, they are taking quarterbacks like Dak Prescott, Deshaun Watson, Russell Wilson, and Kyler Murray, all guys who have extremely high ceilings. I mean, they are guys that can rush the ball and throw the ball with great volume. They're waiting until the 6th or 7th round to take those quarterbacks. And while I draft a bunch of fantasy football teams for my friends who don't really understand what they're doing, I'm seeing all these quarterbacks go in the 2nd or 3rd round. And that's just not something you should be doing. You should be waiting to the very end of your draft or trying to find the value where you can. Don't necessarily be looking at your starting lineup as you draft. Now, lastly, one of the worst mistakes a bunch of people make is they are chasing production from last season. Guys, we're not drafting a fantasy football team for 2019. We're not trying to load it up with 2019 points. We are trying to go out there and we are trying to draft a team that's going to score points in 2020. So what this means is you're not going to necessarily go out there and just use the points scored. I mean, it's funny how many people do this. They pull up points scored in 2019, and then they try to transition that over directly to 2020 and draft off of that list. Situations change all offseason. Situations are different in 2020 than 2019 in terms of how many games is a player going to play. I mean, for instance, Miles Sanders, who's going at the very end of the 1st round or the beginning of the 2nd round of fantasy football drafts, very much deserves that selection, even though if you looked at where he finished in fantasy points in 2019, he was nowhere near that list, just because he was a rookie last season and he did not come on strong until down the stretch in 2019. So please don't go out there, don't go and just pull up 2019 fantasy points scored. That's a massive, massive mistake. And if you're other fantasy owners in your league notice that you're doing that, they can really make you pay by going out there and getting other players. For instance, I mean, there's a reason high-stakes fantasy football drafters are taking Aaron Jones significantly later than Saquon Barkley. I mean, that's just one very basic and very easy to understand example, but there are a million examples of that throughout the entire draft. Don't necessarily go out there and just blindly draft off of last year's points. Situations change, players develop, and we see everything in between. Now, thanks guys. I really hope y'all enjoyed the video. I really hope y'all got something from it. As always, if you did, make sure you drop a like and subscribe.
That may be the greatest catch I've ever seen in my life.